Hello and welcome to Trista's Reading Room. Today we are looking at my book, Book 1 in the Misadventures of a Chosen One's Best Friend, The Prophecy's Chosen Heir. And this book has not released yet. This is going to release on August 31st, so we are very close. Come and join me on August 31st on my Facebook page, Trista Shea, and I have an online event going on to celebrate the release, and you can win copies of this. You can win a t-shirt, you can win stickers, and then I'll have 2 guest authors who are joining me who are also doing giveaways and games, and you can come and meet new people and new books, and have a really great time with all of us. An ancient prophecy, a hidden sword, a kidnapped king. Ever since Toby can remember, he's been the personal servant to the Prince of Aramday and his best friend. When an old nemesis of the king's crashes their 15th birthday ceremony, a wizard saves all of their lives, and a prophecy is recited that reveals Julian is the chosen one. Toby doesn't know what to think, probably because he's fainted. Julian and Toby are tasked with a quest that could save their kingdom and the rest of the world. That is, if the prophecy is even real, and if Julian even is the true chosen one. This is book 1, and there will be 1 available on August 31st, but this is going to be a 10-book series. This is for ages 8+, and there is no content warning. Here's a little bit about me. I'm just going to read it from the back of the book. Trista is an award-winning narrator, author, artist, and all-around creative. She lives with her husband and kitty Beans, and can be found looking for adventure all over the world. She has so many books and series swimming around in her head, it would probably take several lifetimes to get them all on paper. Trista writes stories that are character-driven, contain a hint of magic, a touch of courage, and a whole lot of adventure. And this book was inspired by, I was like, what would it be like if, the main character or one of the main characters of the book was actually the best friend of the chosen one instead of the chosen one himself? And so that was kind of how this went. It's kind of a campy, fun adventure, classic chosen one trope-filled series, but it also tries to poke a little bit of fun at some of those tropes as well. And the relationship between the 2 boys, Julian and Toby, is based off of the Merlin BBC show. So with Arthur and Merlin, I don't know if you've seen that. If you haven't, go watch it. It's quite fun. And the banter is quite fun to write. Chapter 1. The Appointed Hour. The time was 8 o'clock in the morning on the nose. The man in the bell tower had just struck the hour. It was near the beginning of the week, and about halfway through the month of April, when a rickety old fellow came rambling up to the castle gates, requesting an audience with the king and those in his court. Normally, on such occasions, a stranger would be told to make an appointment and come back on the proper day. However, when the 3 guards posted at the gate slurred out this rehearsed response, the old man deftly knocked them on the head once each with his gnarled walking staff and said he would not be turned away at this, the appointed hour. Upon hearing the phrase, the appointed hour, and becoming frustrated that he had gotten the better of them with his staff, they let him pass, assuming he had already made an appointment and was now simply keeping it. "Quatchetty, old man," one of the guards grumbled to his comrades whilst rubbing his reddening forehead with a hand. "He's lucky we didn't turn him away altogether," the second said, sniffing the air importantly and resituating his helmet, which had been knocked askew. "He's slower than my cousin's ancient cow," the last of the 3 men near the gate snorted, his gaze fixed on the old fellow's crooked back as he shuffled toward the castle. The guard shook his head a final time before turning his attention back to his fellow soldiers. He blinked suddenly at the sight of them and then barked out a laugh. Pointing an accusing finger their way, he exclaimed, "You both wake up on the wrong side of the cot today? How'd you make it past inspection like that?" The other 2 turned confused expressions toward each other, then swiftly looked down at their own clothing, before crying out in shock. Their uniforms were each turned this way and that, some parts completely inside out. "You've got to be the sloppiest guards on duty," the 3rd soldier commented with another snort. "You're one to talk," his companion shot back, eyes narrowed. "What are you even wearing? Is that some kind of farmer's smock?" The 3rd soldier glanced down at his own uniform, which was indeed no longer the neat outfit he took pride in, but rather some scratchy sack-like garment. Where'd this come from?" he gasped, worried their captain would catch them out of uniform, and him looking the worst of the three. From up the cobblestone pathway, a light chuckle carried back toward the three men. But when they turned to look, all they saw was the half-bent back of the elderly man, slowly drawing farther and farther away. Wizard Elberose wasn't one of those flashy wizards every bard was talking about, though plenty of stories of him did circulate throughout the 6 kingdoms. He wasn't the type to show off for no reason, and he wasn't the type to let others know the extent of his magical powers to scare them. However, it had seemed a good joke to play on the soldiers at the gate, making them look silly in return for their unkind words. It was a long way up the cobblestone path to the main castle hall. Perhaps not as long if you were of a younger age, but for Elberose it was indeed a fair distance to go, though he had traveled much farther to reach the outer gate, and he would have traveled farther still if the circumstances demanded it of him. The little stunt with the soldiers kept him in good spirits, however, and helped him ignore the soreness of his feet as they carried him toward the growing hope of destiny that lay ahead. "What shall I announce you as?" the herald asked in a bored voice when the wizard arrived at the great hall's grand doors. The man's eyelids were half closed, and he breathed out heavily.
"Elberose the Accomplished, Keeper of Knowledge, Bearer of Truth, Speaker of—"
The servant cut him off with a wave of his gloved hand.
Yes, of course."
He shuffled his feet as he turned and gave a mighty heave to the double doors. A little gasp escaped his lips with the effort. The unenthusiastic herald led the way inside the hall. He halted after a few steps and cleared his throat. A pained expression wrinkled his brow, as if remembering what the older man had told him only moments ago was a burdensome chore.
"Elberot the Ancient, he keeps knowledge and speaks truth, or something of that nature." "Elberot?"
The king repeated the name, looking down from his seat upon the throne. He straightened and appeared to be searching his memory.
"Did you have an appointment? Why does that name sound familiar?" "It would, sire,"
Elberose said, pushing the incompetent servant to the side with a nudge of his staff and moving forward alone.
"If it were the correct name. But it is, in fact, incorrect, so your memory should find no past use of it. But perhaps—"
This time it was the king himself who cut the wizard off as he stood and said,
"Elberose the wizard! Yes, now I do recall."
He smiled, but the corners of his royal mouth slowly fell as he thought on the name of his newly arrived guest.
"Weren't you the one who sent that poor duke in the next kingdom over, off on that terrible quest he never returned from?" "Duke Wiltonburn?"
the wizard asked, meandering his way farther into the room so the king could lower his voice to a more conversational tone.
"Yes, that's the one,"
King Beryl replied. He clapped both hands over his rotund belly, and his eyes took on a skeptical look.
"Seemed like a nasty business." "It was very nasty indeed,"
Elberose agreed with a nod, coming to a halt in front of the steps that led up to the dais.
"The fellow was never the same after that quest." "Yes, well, no one ever heard from him again, so I'd say he wasn't the same." "We did agree he should have no further contact with the outside world, should he choose to remain in the Fey Realm, and he did." "Fey Realm? Goodness, is that where he went? I thought he went off to best a troll, or something of that sort. They say the beast slayed the poor chap." The king spluttered, a bit confused. "Tales do tend to spread on their own, don't they?"
Elberose smiled softly, readjusting the grip he had on his staff.
"There was a troll involved, if I remember correctly. A nasty one at that. But I do believe Duke Wiltonburn is now living quite happily with his fey wife and their 4 hounds. He seems to enjoy hunting and foraging about in the wilderness." "Indeed? Well, I would never have guessed," the king muttered, staring off into the distance in his stupor as he reseated himself on his elaborate throne. "But I did not come here to discuss the matter of the Duke with you, King Beryl,"
Elberose said, casting his eyes about the hall, which was oddly empty.
"No, I should think not,"
the king replied, snapping out of his shock and training his gaze back on his guest.
What have you come here for? Are you certain you had an appointment? We have never entertained a wizard in these halls before." "It would seem you do not entertain anyone in these halls,"
Elberose stated, motioning to the empty courtier seats and bleary walls of stone.
"Where are the nobles of this kingdom? Where are your knights and the prince? Where is your queen?" "I suppose they're likely at breakfast, or perhaps out on the lawn for some mid-morning tea."
King Beryl shrugged.
"We're at peace, Elberose. There's no need to keep nobles and knights stuffed up in these empty halls of decorum. Around here, we lean toward a less strict way of thinking and doing things." "Which might be well and good, my king, if not for the times we find ourselves in."
"And what times are those?" The king's eyebrows lowered.
"I see and hear nothing but reports of good fortune and pleasures. Abundance is ours to enjoy." "It is those very things which have clouded your eyes,"
Elberose explained sternly, thumping his staff down onto the stones by his feet.
"You sit in peace when there is chaos mounting in the skies. You indulge in pleasures and plenty when there is famine and scarcity gnawing its way ever nearer. You would not see these things for what they are, for the fear of losing what you have. But peace has made your kingdom weak, and abundance has driven your people to forget what having little truly means."
The king sighed and frowned slightly.
"I recall now that some call you Elberose the Doomsayer, Elberose the Alarmist. You see monsters in the shadow of the sun and fate in the lyrics of a lullaby." "Fate? Yes, I do see fate. I see destiny, and you should see it too, your highness. For now is the appointed hour. Now is the foretold time. We cannot tarry, we cannot linger, and we cannot ignore the words of the prophecy."
"Prophecy? What prophecy would that be?" The king's eyes continued to narrow, and he shifted uncomfortably on his seat. Elberose placed his staff on the first of the steps leading up to the throne, and leaned forward earnestly.
"The prophecy of the Chosen One. The prophecy of Agrabindum the Great."
"Oh, good gracious, not that hogwash!" King Beryl batted at the air like the wizard's words had left a nasty stench that stung his royal nose.
"Hogwash? I dare say it is anything but!"
Elberose declared, slightly taken aback at the king's outburst.
"This prophecy has been in incubation for ages. Long has it been tarrying and waiting for the proper heir. Long has it been told to me by my father and grandfather to avoid such talk. Agrabindum the Great was a legend, Elberose, nothing more. He was a figurehead to inspire the people in their time of need. He was a fantasy that led youths on fruitless ventures and kept kings fixated on the past. And I dare say it's people like you, the ones who won't stop whispering his name, that end up sending people such as that duke off to their untimely ends." "People like me?"
Elberose's back straightened, and he set his mouth in a thin line.
"Yes, people of your kind and nature. Wizards. Magic wielders who can't see the world properly because they're not normal people."
King Beryl stood and huffed at his guest in a most unbecoming fashion. He was, after all, now late for a game of croquet with his wife.
"You're always wanting there to be war and doom and creatures of terror, because it's when you are the most important, when you are needed. But I dare say we don't need you and all your fancy words and old forgotten stories. We're at peace, and will remain that way if we refuse to listen to the lies you lot are peddling."
There was silence for a moment, as the two stared at each other, both a bit hot between the ears. Finally, Elberose's shoulders sagged, and he shook his head with a sigh. When he looked back up at the king, his eyes held only pity.
"Perhaps, King Beryl, you once had the makings of a great man, a valiant lord, and a gracious protector. But I see that you despise these things, and would only spurn this mantle. You have rejected the prophecy, and thus the prophecy shall reject you and your son."
Elberose pointed a thin, aged finger at the king, and spoke with a firm finality in his voice.
"You have shunned the call of the Chosen One, but mark my words, the prophecy will find its heir. From your very halls it shall choose one worthy of the task. Get out of my court!"
the king cried, pointing toward the grand doors at the front of the hall.
How dare you come into my home saying such things and wielding these wild accusations against me?"
The wizard pulled his staff toward his side and lowered his voice.
"My road will lead me here again one day, and when it does, I shall not find a kingdom in love with itself or too full of its own pleasure, but rather one ripe for change amidst the turmoil such peace as you've created often brings. You will be Aramday's downfall, King Barrel. It is already begun."
Chapter 2. Nightly Shenanigans. 30 years later. Toby's eyes shot open. His body lay completely still beneath the blanket he'd so carefully tucked himself into a few hours ago. A slight scuffling sound echoed off the stone floor a second time, and he caught his breath. Someone else was in the tiny bedchamber with him. But was it just another mouse, or was it an intruder with a fouler purpose? Toby swallowed nervously and held his breath as he strained all the muscles in his ears to locate the exact place where the muffled movements came from. Something shifted near the wooden door, and he sucked in a lungful of air, instantly regretting it and hoping whoever it was hadn't noticed. He slowly lowered his trembling hand over the left side of the bed, groping about blindly for the weapon he kept nearby for occasions such as this. His long fingers brushed the edge of the wooden staff, and it skittered away about an inch or so across the floor. He hesitated and grit his teeth, hoping he hadn't ruined his surprise attack for the second time in the last 10 seconds. Toby noticed the figure shifting in the darkness, and he knew he had to act quickly. He strained his fingers further, and his left hand finally curled around the staff in a stranglehold. In that instant, he sprang from his bed with a cry that ripped from the deepest part of him. Except his fear choked it in his throat, and the shout came out more like a hiccuping squeak instead. The shadowed figure moved at the same time that Toby brought the staff up to strike. Toby was thrown off balance and managed to beat himself in the head instead of his assailant. The hefty knock to his noggin sent him tripping backward into the bed frame. His knees buckled and he fell into his rumpled blanket with a groan, the staff clattering to the stone floor at his feet. "Steady on, Toby! You're going to wake up the entire castle," a voice said in an amused tone. The sound of a flame fizzling into life hissed through the small room, and Toby groaned again, his body relaxing in jelly-like relief. "What are you doing here?" he asked, grimacing as his hand brushed over the egg-sized lump that was forming on his forehead. "The real question is, what are you doing?" The other boy, now framed by the firelight, stepped up beside the bed and stared down at Toby's limp form with raised brows. "You almost poked your eye out with that thing." "Yeah, and your point is?" Toby demanded, a bit frustrated he'd been so rudely awakened at this hour for a head-whacking, and by his own hand. "My point is, you didn't need to react like that. It's just me." The other boy grinned, his blonde locks swept perfectly to either side of his handsome face in an even frame. "Okay, but what are just you doing here, at this time of night, sneaking up on me in the dark?" Toby sat up, the eye under the bruised lump twitching sporadically a few times. "Come on, Toby, don't play dumb. You know why I'm here." The blonde boy planted the hand that wasn't holding the torch on his waist and smiled widely. Toby's shoulders slumped, and his face went slack. "You know what, Julian? I don't. I was actually sleeping just now, not pondering the mystery of why in the world the prince would be barging into my bedroom so close to midnight." Julian rolled his eyes and shoved the torch into an empty bracket on the wall. He turned back to Toby and shook his head dolefully. "Sad, really? You just sleeping the last hours away like this? Not a care in the world?" "The last hours of what?" Toby asked, his voice flat. "The last hours of our youth," Julian declared passionately, throwing one fisted hand into the air. "Tomorrow we come of age, and our entire future awaits us. We'll only be 14 for a few more hours. It's the last night we can do whatever we want." "Pretty sure you'll keep doing whatever you want even after your birthday tomorrow?" Toby mused, slumping back down onto the bed. His fine black hair fell into his eyes, and he swiped it aside with a clumsy hand. "Oh, come on! You know you want to go on one last adventure with me." Julian grinned, leaning over his friend and cocking his head to one side. Toby rolled over, pulled a blanket around his head, and grunted a very muffled,
"Good night."
Julian's voice pulled away as he stepped backward.
"So that's how it's going to be? You'd leave your prince to pull off this last shenanigan on his own then? To say nothing of your best friend?"
There was a brief moment of silence.
"All right, if that's how you want it. Kinda figured you'd be interested to know what I've got planned, but hey! Far be it from me to interrupt your beauty sleep. That's on me,"
Julian said. The prince's acting was so bad, Toby was a little annoyed it was starting to eat away at his will, despite that obvious fact.
"See you in the morning,"
Julian called, picking up the torch again and heading for the door. It was just pulling shut behind the prince when Toby's curiosity got the better of him. Sitting up, he asked in a beleaguered voice,
"What's the plan?"
The door pushed back in, and Julian's beaming face returned.
"You're gonna love it." "This is the plan?"
Toby asked, his teeth bared in a grimace and his eyebrows quirked at irregular angles. His hair ruffled around his ears in the summer night's breeze, and he shivered, though the temperatures weren't cold.
"You said I love it. I don't love it."
"But isn't it grand?" Julian declared, elbowing his friend in the arm and accidentally knocking him off balance. Toby had to reach out and catch the edge of the wall to keep himself from falling.
"No one will catch us, 'cause no one would ever dream we'd be up here." "Maybe because we shouldn't be. This is insane."
Toby gripped the wall, clinging to it tightly, his feet teetering on the edge of the precarious drop.
"Think of the view. It'll be spectacular. Come on,"
Julian encouraged, patting his servant and best friend's arm before leaping off the edge of the wall and into the night air. He landed on a rooftop a few feet below and motioned for Toby to follow suit.
"Your turn. It's closer than it looks."
Toby took several deep breaths through his teeth, measured the distance with his hands, paced back and forth, then finally shook his head emphatically.
"I don't think I can do it. You know I don't like heights." "You slogged all the way up the second tallest tower's stairs only to turn back now?"
The prince put both hands out in a questioning, pleading gesture.
"Come on! We can climb all the way to the peak of this tower's roof from here."
Toby puzzled over the predicament and ran through every possible outcome of the scenario in his mind, most ending with him falling off the roof and plummeting toward the ground below. Finally, he hesitantly sat down on the wall and scooted himself over the edge, hanging onto the ledge with his hands as he lowered himself down. He dangled in the open air for an instant, his feet not quite able to touch the rooftop below. With a shuddering breath, he closed his eyes and dropped the remaining 3 inches.
"Not so bad now, was it?"
Julian reassured, helping him to his feet.
"You're a natural." "A natural disaster, maybe,"
Toby muttered, dazed he'd managed to get this far, dazed that he'd allowed himself to be talked into it at all.
"Come on, we'll climb to the top and carve our initials into the flagpole. That way, no one will ever forget our names even after we're gone." "But if it's just our initials, whoever finds them could easily be confused. They might guess your name was Jimbo Hoppenstein and I, Tootaloofers Snugget."
Toby tried to keep his legs from shaking too badly and refused to let his gaze wander to the edge of the rooftop. Instead, he fixed his eyes on Julian's blonde mop of hair that reflected the full moon's radiance in an ethereal way.
"My, why didn't your mother name you Tootaloofers? That's quite the becoming name for one such as yourself."
Julian grinned, offering a hand to the other boy. They began to shift their weight over the roof tiles and hike upward along the incline.
"I don't know, Jimbo. Perhaps I'll ask her the next time she comes for a visit,"
Toby replied snarkily, swallowing back his rising fear and continuing to climb. The swallowing of the fear thing didn't prove very successful, but he did manage to keep his footing so he wouldn't tumble into the courtyard below. After what felt like a torturously long time to Toby, and after much nudging and optimistic encouragement on the part of Julian, they arrived at the roof's flat peak. Toby sucked in a great gasp of air as he rushed toward the flagpole and wrapped his hands tightly around it in eager thankfulness. He dared to peek back the way they'd come, but instant regret settled like a rock in his stomach. His eyes snapped shut and he whispered,
"And how are we supposed to get down?"
"Well, we're not," Julian snorted, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Not yet, anyway. We have to wait until midnight. Then we can go.
Okay.
Toby breathed, focusing on the in and out movement of the air through his lungs.
You let me know when that is.
Julian stepped around his friend to the opposite side of the roof and pulled an exceptionally short dagger from his belt. He grabbed hold of the sturdy flagpole with one hand and began to carve their initials into the smooth wood with the other. It took some doing, but he was satisfied with his rough letterwork in the end. Julian quickly replaced the knife before sitting down at the edge of the peak to gaze out over the kingdom of Aramday.
You really should open your eyes,
he called over his shoulder.
It's an amazing view. The moon lights up everything for miles. I'll think about it,
Toby replied, his eyes squeezing shut all the harder.
Perhaps when we're leaving I'll crack them open.
Suit yourself. The prince shrugged, continuing to survey the lands of his father. A sudden flash of movement to the left caught his attention, and he scooted forward a bit, his boots scraping along the pockmarks in the tiles.
What's that?
He breathed.
Don't do that, Julian,
Toby warned, his face scrunching up in distaste.
It's rude to trick someone into doing something they don't want to do, like opening their eyes.
I'm not joking, Julian replied distractedly as he squinted into the night.
There really is something out there.
The slight sounds of muttering and shuffling could be heard behind him as Toby shifted and then crawled up alongside him.
If I pass out, it's your fault.
I'd catch you before you fell to your untimely end, Julian assured, then pointed out across the grassy field that lay before the castle.
Did you see that?
Toby sighed and plopped his rear down, scuttling his feet around in front of him. Craning his neck, he stared hard in the direction his friend had indicated.
What am I looking for exactly?
But Julian didn't have to answer, because out of the darkness swelled a great creature, or something that must have been a creature of some kind. It only shimmered under the moon for a moment before it vanished, completely dissolving into the night, leaving behind a pair of shocked and gobsmacked boys.
Was that a dragon?
Toby stuttered after a few moments of silence had slipped by. Julian scoffed.
Don't be foolish. Dragons don't exist anymore. Then what was that thing? It was huge.
Not sure, but it can't hurt us up here. Besides, it's gone now, and maybe we never saw it in the first place. Maybe it was just a bit of moonlight reflecting off the castle walls.
Right.
Toby drew the word out and pursed his lips. He didn't wish to dwell on the implications of such a creature, however, so when the thing didn't reappear, he decided Julian might be right. Perhaps they hadn't seen anything real at all. The friends sat in silence for a while longer, waiting for midnight to arrive and their birthday with it. Toby eventually began to drift off again, his head drooping onto Julian's shoulder and his mouth hanging open in a silent snore. After a time, the prince noticed a spiral of drool pooling in the corner of his friend's mouth. He quickly prodded Toby awake.
Hey, sleeping potato, rise and shine. The pony's fleece is in the baker's basket,
Toby exclaimed, sitting up suddenly, his back stiff. Slowly, reality began to set in, and he jerked backward, aghast.
We're on the roof? How do we get on the roof?
We've been up here for hours. Regretfully, though, it's time we climbed down and got you into bed. Toby tried unsuccessfully to pull himself together and appear a touch more dignified.
It's midnight, then?
He gulped. Julian nodded, a serious hint slipping into his voice. We're 15 now.
Well, 15-year-old Julian had better be prepared to carry me off this roof, because I don't see another way for me to get back to the wall. You could try falling. You could try keeping your mouth shut.
The prince laughed, rolled his eyes, and motioned for Toby to inch closer to the edge.
Come on, I'll help you down.
And that is it for today. If you want to read more of the Prophecy's Chosen Heir, be sure to come and hang out with me on Facebook on August 31st as we party for the release. And then check it out on Amazon. It will be available in all formats, and you can find it there. Thanks. Have a great day.